I stopped in the hallway because my knee ached, and I needed a moment before moving again. The pause should have been ordinary, nothing more than age slowing me down the way it always does. But then I heard my grandson's voice through the half-open door, sharp in a way a child's voice shouldn't be. He said, "Why does he even deserve a room?" The words didn't echo. They landed as if dropped straight into my chest. I stayed still, not out of choice, but because the question froze me from the inside out. His tone wasn't confused or careless. It was practiced, shaped by someone older, someone who thought that way long before he repeated it. My hand tightened on the doorframe as I tried to make sense of the bitterness in a boy who once used to run into my arms after school. From my place in the hallway, I could see part of the living room. My grandson stood with his arms crossed, shifting his weight with the confidence of someone who believed he was right. His teacher sat across from him. She had come to record a short interview for some school project, but now her expression had changed. She stared at him, then at her tablet, and quietly tapped the screen as though marking something she hadn't planned to document. He didn't notice me at first. That might have been better. Watching him like that, so certain, so dismissive, was enough to make the room feel colder even from where I stood. I waited for my daughter to correct him, to say he had crossed a line, to remind him that respect wasn't optional. Instead, she only sighed. The kind of sigh that wasn't disappointment or surprise, but something closer to agreement. When her eyes finally met mine, she didn't widen or tense or show any trace of embarrassment. She simply looked away, as if she had expected me to hear it and didn't see a reason to soften the blow. It was the first moment I realized the distance between us had grown far wider than I understood. I didn't step into the room or ask for an explanation. I turned and walked back toward my bedroom, keeping my steps steady even though something inside me felt unsteady and exposed. The house I had helped build, the one I had filled with years of memories, suddenly felt unfamiliar. It wasn't the comment itself that did it. It was the certainty behind it. It was the tone that sounded like it wasn't the first time he'd said it. It was the silence my daughter offered instead of guidance. As I reached the doorway of my room, I heard the teacher's voice drop to a softer register, almost cautious. She said something I couldn't fully make out, but the tension in the air thickened in a way I didn't need words to understand. Whatever she noticed, she wasn't brushing it aside. I sat on the edge of my bed, letting the weight of the moment settle. A child doesn't speak like that unless someone has taught him, and cruelty doesn't grow overnight. It grows in conversations held when they think you can't hear. This wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Something in this house had been preparing for a shift, and I had just heard the first clear proof of it. After my wife passed, the house felt bigger than it needed to be. Rooms that once carried her voice became quiet, and I learned how loneliness can sit in a chair across from you even when you're trying not to notice it. I managed the basics, but everything beyond that felt heavier, slower. My daughter stepped in more often then, picking up groceries, sorting mail, driving me to appointments. I was grateful, and maybe too grateful, because I didn't question how quickly I leaned on her help. She started handling my mail because she said she didn't want me getting overwhelmed. At first it felt like kindness. Then it became routine. She'd bring in the envelopes, glance through them before I even touched them, and toss certain ones aside with an offhand, "You don't need to worry about that." When I asked what was inside, she answered patiently at first, then with a tight smile that meant I was becoming a burden. I stopped asking as often, and that silence became its own kind of habit. Over time, my grandson picked up her tone without understanding the weight of it. He made little comments about my slow steps or how long I took to find things. At first, they were clumsy jokes, the kind kids repeat without meaning harm. But as months passed, those comments sharpened. He'd roll his eyes when I forgot where I placed the keys. He'd sigh when I asked him to repeat something. He spoke to me the way he heard others speak when they thought I wouldn't mind or wouldn't notice. When I brought it up to my daughter, she brushed it away with a laugh. "Dad, he's just being a kid. Don't take everything so seriously." It wasn't the words that stung, but the casual way she dismissed them. I told myself it didn't matter, that children say things without thinking. I kept repeating that excuse until it sounded true enough to ignore. A neighbor pulled me aside one afternoon as I walked back from the mailbox. He spoke in that careful tone people use when they don't want to step over a line. "Your daughter seems very focused on your space," he said. "I hope everything's okay." I gave him a polite smile and assured him it was nothing. even though a small part of me wondered what he had seen. But I let that question fade, the way I'd let many things fade. It was easier not to think too much. Now, sitting alone and replaying the comment I overheard earlier, why does he even deserve a room? Those small moments began to arrange themselves into a pattern I should have recognized sooner. Her impatience, his copying, the mail I never saw, the conversations that grew shorter, the way my daughter moved through the house as if she had already decided what parts mattered and what parts didn't. I used to think those moments were disconnected, just fragments of a family trying to adjust after loss. But hearing my grandson's question made something inside me shift. Those fragments didn't look random anymore. They looked like pieces of something being built in secret, and I had been too tired, too trusting, to see it forming. The first sign came on a quiet afternoon when my daughter walked into my room without knocking, her eyes scanning the walls as if she were taking inventory. She said the house felt too cramped lately, and suggested I consider downsizing my room so my grandson could have space to grow. The way she said it made me feel like a guest in my own home. I told her I was comfortable where I was, and she smiled politely. But something in her expression didn't move with the smile. My grandson began avoiding me around the same time. He'd slip past me in the hallway without a word or look away when I tried to start a conversation. When he did speak, he repeated little phrases that didn't belong in a child's mouth. "Mom says you don't need so much room," he muttered once, his eyes glued to his tablet. Another day he said, "It's better if kids have the bigger space." They weren't opinions, just echoes of someone else's voice. One evening, my daughter mentioned the room arrangement again, this time brushing it off as just temporary. She said my grandson needed the master bedroom for a school project setup, something about better light and more floor space. But a few days later, she mentioned it as if it were permanent, talking about how kids thrive when they have room to grow. The shift was subtle, but noticeable enough to make my stomach tighten in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the discomfort, telling myself I was being sensitive, but the feeling stayed with me. A week later, I went looking for an old warranty card I kept in my dresser drawer. When I pulled the drawer open, it slid out too easily, almost as if someone had been there recently. Inside, things weren't where I'd left them. Papers were stacked differently. A folder sat slightly crooked. I knew how I kept my things. I might move slowly these days, but I'm not careless. As I sifted through the drawer, I noticed something missing: my property tax letter. It was the only official document I kept in that drawer. At first, I wondered if I had misplaced it, but I could picture it clearly, tucked under a stack of envelopes, exactly where it always was. Its absence left a hollow feeling in my chest. Someone had been in my room, sorting through things they shouldn't have touched. That evening, while we sat at the dinner table, I casually mentioned that I wanted to reorganize some of my files. My daughter froze for half a second, so fast I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching her face. Then she smiled wider than usual, her voice suddenly too bright, as she said she could help with anything I needed. It wasn't kindness I heard. It was nerves. It was someone smoothing over their tracks. I didn't accuse her or raise my voice. I just nodded and let the moment pass, storing it with the others in a quiet corner of my mind. Individually, they were small. Together, they felt like the beginning of something I should have paid more attention to long ago. I woke early the next morning, long before the house stirred, and sat at my desk with my laptop. I rarely logged into my property account, but something about the missing letter kept bothering me. When the dashboard finally loaded, the first thing I saw was a red notification about recent activity. I clicked it, expecting maybe a system update or a reminder. Instead, it showed login attempts from a device I didn't recognize, something labeled mobile guest. The timestamp lined up with a day I remembered my daughter being home while I ran errands. I didn't panic, but the unease settled deeper. I printed the log quietly, folding the page and slipping it into the drawer beneath my socks. It was the first piece of real evidence that someone else was looking at things they shouldn't. I didn't know what they were planning yet, but I knew enough to keep moving carefully. Later that week, I decided to visit the local property office. I told my daughter I was going to pick up bread. She barely looked up from her phone, just nodded and said, "Sure, Dad." The drive was slow, but steady. At the office, I asked a clerk to walk me through my account, pretending I was confused by the online system. She pulled up my file, scanned it, then frowned slightly. Not an alarm, more like recognition. "There have been a few drafted forms here," she said, turning the monitor toward me. "None submitted, but they were started." I leaned closer. The drafts were dated over the last 2 weeks. One of them had a title I'd never seen before: Request for Living Space Reallocation. My name was on it, tied to my address, as if I had begun the process myself. A cold feeling moved through me. Not fear exactly, more like confirmation of something I hadn't wanted to believe. I thanked the clerk and left with a printed copy of the draft, the pages folded tightly in my coat pocket. The air outside felt colder than when I'd walked in. When I returned home, my daughter was waiting in the hallway. Her eyes flicked to the side, toward my room. "Hey," she said lightly. "I was thinking, it might be easier if you and I both had keys to your bedroom, for emergencies." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I told her I'd think about it, keeping my voice calm. She nodded too quickly and stepped away, her shoulders tense. It wasn't the request itself that bothered me. It was the timing. It was the sudden interest in access she'd never asked for before. A few minutes later, my grandson wandered into the kitchen. He looked at me briefly, then said, almost robotically, "Mom said the room's not really Grandpa's anymore." He said it the way other children repeat lines from cartoons, familiar, rehearsed, and without understanding. I didn't answer. I simply watched him walk away, his small shoulders carrying words that didn't belong to him. And for the first time, I remembered the teacher's expression from that day, her startled look, the careful way she tapped her tablet, as if capturing something important. The house wasn't whispering anymore. It was speaking plainly, and I was finally listening. It was after dinner when my daughter came into my room, carrying a neat stack of papers pressed against her chest. She didn't ask if it was a good time or if I felt up to going through anything. She simply set the stack on my desk and said I needed to sign everything before the weekend. Her voice was even, but too controlled, like someone trying not to show they were in a rush. I nodded slowly, watching her fingers tremble just enough to betray that these papers mattered far more to her than she wanted me to realize. She explained that the forms were household agreements, small, routine updates to keep things organized. The words sounded harmless, but the way she said them felt rehearsed. I sat down, pulled the first page toward me, and read silently while she lingered close by, pretending to tidy my dresser. None of the documents were labeled the way real household forms usually were. The phrasing was vague. The signature lines seemed placed oddly, and certain sections were worded with long sentences that didn't fit the simplicity she claimed. Halfway through the stack, I paused. One paragraph slipped in a phrase about temporary relocation to the lower-level room for safety and efficiency. I read it twice. It was a basement room, not unsafe, but unfinished, cold, and nothing like the space I had lived in for decades. The phrasing wasn't about safety. It was about removal. The shift wasn't accidental. I turned the page, and a detail stopped me cold. One of the documents already had my name printed under the signature line, except it wasn't just my name. It was a digital version of my signature, the one I only used for online forms. I had never touched this document. Seeing my signature there felt like finding a stranger's footsteps in my bedroom. I pushed the paper back slightly, my fingers steadier than my breath. My daughter watched me too closely when I asked for time to read everything properly. Her smile thinned, and she let out a soft, frustrated sound before trying to cover it with a laugh. "Dad, it's all simple," she insisted. "You're overthinking." But the tension around her eyes gave her away. And when I said I wanted to look at the papers in the morning, her shoulders stiffened as if I had ruined something carefully planned. She left the room without another word. I heard her footsteps move down the hall, quick and uneven. I stayed seated, letting the quiet settle. Something about the night felt tight, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I stood, walked toward my door, and was about to close it when a faint voice drifted from the kitchen. She was on the phone, whispering sharply, "He'll sign it. He has to. He'll be out of that room soon. Stop worrying. I'll handle it." The words cut through the air with a clarity that made the earlier documents suddenly make perfect sense. Her tone wasn't confused or overwhelmed. It was confident, assured, certain of a deadline I hadn't known existed. I stepped back into my room, closing the door quietly. Whatever she was planning, it was no longer a guess. It had a timeline, and I had just stumbled into the middle of it. I was sitting at the kitchen table the next afternoon, pretending to read while the papers from last night stayed hidden beneath a folded towel. When the doorbell rang, my daughter called out that she was busy, so I went to answer it myself. Standing on the porch was my grandson's teacher, hands clasped in front of her, eyes carrying a worry she couldn't hide. She asked quietly if she could speak with me alone. I stepped aside, letting her in, feeling the unease rise the moment I saw her glance toward the hallway, as if checking whether we were being watched. We moved to the small sitting room, a place my daughter rarely entered. The teacher sat across from me, back straight, as though she had practiced this conversation before coming. She said she wanted to talk about what happened yesterday. The comment my grandson made, the one that had settled in my chest like a stone. Her voice was steady, but there was a seriousness underneath it that kept tightening the air between us. Then she told me she had recorded the moment, not because she expected anything cruel to be said, but because she was visiting several homes for a school project and kept notes and audio clips for accuracy. She asked if I wanted to hear it. I nodded once, not trusting my own voice. She tapped her tablet, and suddenly my living room filled with the sound of my grandson's mockery again, harsher and more deliberate than I remembered. Then came the part that made my hands go cold. Mom said it'll be our room soon. Grandpa won't complain. The teacher paused the recording. The silence that followed felt heavier than the words themselves. She watched me carefully, as though measuring whether I understood the gravity of what she had just played. I didn't say anything at first. I was too busy trying to make sense of the tone my grandson used, the certainty, the familiarity. It wasn't the voice of a child repeating something once. It was repetition. It was expectation. She cleared her throat gently and said she wasn't here to judge my family, but she explained that educators are trained to recognize signs of elder mistreatment, especially when children repeat information that suggests planned displacement. She told me there are mandatory reporting guidelines for situations that look like manipulation, coercion, or loss of autonomy. Her professionalism didn't soften the message. It sharpened it. She asked if I had noticed anything else unusual at home. I didn't answer directly, but she seemed to understand enough from the tension in my expression. She encouraged me to review any documents my daughter had asked me to sign and to make sure nothing had been altered without my consent. Her tone remained calm, but there was urgency beneath it, an unspoken warning that I might already be deeper into a plan than I realized. Before leaving, she pressed a small card into my hand. "If you need help," she said softly, "call someone you trust. Don't wait." When the door closed behind her, the house felt different. The shadows in the hallway seemed longer, and the quiet no longer felt like peace. For the first time, I understood that what I overheard wasn't just disrespect, it was preparation, and I was the only one who hadn't been told the timeline. I waited until the house settled into its usual evening rhythm before gathering everything in one place. The recording stayed on the teacher's tablet, but she had sent me a secure copy, which I moved onto a small flash drive I could slip into my pocket. Next to it, I set the drafts my daughter brought, each page marked with small notes I'd made in pencil. The login logs from my property account were printed and folded twice to keep them discreet. Seeing them together on the table felt like laying out pieces of a puzzle I never wanted to build. The next morning, I left early and walked to the small legal office 3 streets away. The sign said Elder Rights and Planning, though I had avoided looking directly at it for years, telling myself I didn't need help yet. A woman with calm eyes met me in a back room where the door closed silently behind her. She asked what brought me in, and for the first time, I said the words out loud, that something inside my own family felt wrong. She didn't flinch. She only asked to see the documents. She went through everything slowly, page by page, tapping her finger whenever she recognized a tactic. She pointed to the altered forms, the unauthorized signature, the attempted address change. She said these were early steps seen in quiet property takeovers, changes that look harmless until the final papers appear. Her tone stayed even, but there was no doubt in her expression. She called it a pattern, a deliberate one. When I left her office, the air outside felt colder than when I arrived. She had told me to continue acting normal, to sign nothing, to wait until my daughter brought what she called the final push. It would be the moment they needed my signature to seal whatever they had planned. That was when the evidence had to be presented cleanly, not in pieces. Back at the house, the tension had thickened, though no one acknowledged it. My daughter glanced at me the moment I stepped inside, her eyes sharp, as if checking, whether I had gone somewhere she didn't approve of. She asked casually why I left so early, but the question carried an edge. When I replied simply that I needed a walk, her jaw tightened for a second before she forced a smile. She didn't hold it long. Later that afternoon, she slid another stack of papers onto the counter, tapping them impatiently while I finished my tea. I said I'd look at them after dinner. The snap in her response came too fast to hide. She recovered quickly, pretending it was a long day at work, but her eyes kept drifting to the documents as if she feared I might hide them. The grandson's behavior had changed again. He wandered into my room without knocking, staring around as though assessing the space. He muttered, "Mom says it's too big for one old person," before walking out without waiting for a reply. His voice didn't sound confused. It sounded coached. By nightfall, the house felt like it was waiting for something. And I knew I had to wait too. Wait for the moment the advisors said would reveal everything they had been building around me. She entered my room without knocking, a thick folder clutched against her chest. The hallway light behind her cast a long shadow across the floor, stretching toward my bed as if it meant to push me back. She said, "We're doing this tonight," in a voice too steady to be honest. The words sounded prepared, rehearsed, as though she had practiced them on her drive home. I set my glasses down and watched her place the papers between us like a barrier. I didn't touch them. Instead, I asked her to explain why documents from my drawer were missing. Her eyes flicked sideways for half a second, then she forced a confused smile. I asked why the forms she brought last week had my digital signature printed on them. The smile cracked. She said she was overwhelmed, tired, dealing with bills, dealing with work, dealing with a child who never listens. Her voice rose and fell too fast. None of it matched the calm certainty she used when telling others I was forgetful. She kept blaming pressure, deadlines, confusing instructions, anything that didn't require taking responsibility. She shuffled the pages loudly, as if noise could erase questions. I let her talk until her explanations began contradicting each other. She didn't notice. She only grew more frantic, insisting everything was already arranged, and she just needed me to make it official. My heartbeat stayed slow. Hers didn't. Grandson lingered at the door, drawn by her sharp tone. He leaned on the frame, looking at the folder like it was something he'd seen before. When she snapped at him to go wait in the living room, he muttered, "But you said I should pack early for Grandpa's move." Silence swallowed the room. She froze, staring at him as though the floor had opened beneath her feet. He realized too late what he revealed, and his hand crept to his mouth. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I reached into my drawer and took out the flash drive. Her eyes widened in a way she couldn't hide. Without a word, I connected it to the small speaker I kept on my table. The recording played clearly, her son's voice, the teacher nearby, the tone of a child repeating something said many times before. "Mom said it'll be our room soon. Grandpa won't complain." The quiet that followed felt heavier than any argument. She whispered, "Turn it off," but her voice lacked strength. Instead, I answered a call from the advisor waiting on standby. I set the phone on speaker. She identified herself calmly and said she had reviewed all materials. She stated that the documents, signature misuse, address change attempt, and recorded statements fell under coercion, attempted displacement, and fraud. My daughter's breathing became shallow. She tried to interject, but each time she did, the advisor explained another element of her pattern. My daughter dropped into a chair, clutching her forehead. She didn't apologize. She didn't deny it. She only repeated that she didn't mean for it to look like this, words that avoided the truth she could no longer outrun. The folder between us no longer resembled paperwork. It looked like evidence. Before she could gather herself, the advisor ended with one final instruction. "Do not sign anything. Everything from here will be handled formally." The room stayed still. The story she built around me had finally broken apart. The next morning began with a knock that wasn't hers. Two officials stood on the porch, calm, professional, carrying clipboards instead of judgment. I stepped aside and let them in, the house feeling smaller with every measured footstep they took. They introduced themselves and explained they were following up on a mandated report filed by my grandson's teacher. Their voices were steady, almost gentle, but the meaning behind their visit pressed heavy against the walls. I led them to the table where the document still sat untouched. They asked to hear the recording first. I played it without speaking. The officials listened with fixed expressions, writing small notes each time my grandson repeated words too adult for him. When it ended, one of them asked if I had copies. I handed over the flash drive. They never raised their voices, never reacted harshly. Their quiet professionalism made the moment feel even heavier. The truth was no longer just my burden. It was now a case file. By midday, my daughter received her own call. She stepped outside to take it, but through the window I saw her pace along the driveway, hand trembling against her phone. She learned her employer had opened a review of the forms she had submitted using my information. Her voice, usually so confident, cracked under the pressure of explaining why my signature appeared on documents I never saw. She ended the call in silence, unable to look toward the house. Soon after, our financial analyst met with me at the dining table. He opened his laptop and went through logs tied to my accounts. He pointed to unauthorized address change attempts, attempts to redirect statements, and repeated login failures from a device not associated with me. There was no judgment in his tone, only a firm clarity. He explained how patterns like this often preceded property reassignment or forced relocation. Each confirmation felt like another part of my home, shifting further from what it used to be. My advisor arrived shortly after to help finalize protections. She gathered every document and placed them in organized folders, making sure I regained full control over property titles, digital access, and beneficiary settings. She guided me through resets, lockouts, and alerts that would notify me if anyone attempted changes again. She spoke calmly, but even she paused once, as if absorbing the weight of a daughter doing this to her own father. As the evening settled in, the house grew painfully quiet. My daughter stayed in her room with the door shut. No footsteps, no excuses, no attempts to undo the damage she had set in motion. The officials left promising updates. The analyst filed his report. My advisor assured me everything necessary had been triggered. The system was moving, and there was no turning it back. I sat alone in the living room, hands resting on the armrests my wife once polished. Vindication didn't feel like victory. It felt like standing inside a hollow space where a family used to be. The consequences were real, and they were needed. But they carved out something I wasn't sure could ever be replaced. The house felt different the next morning. Not safer, not warmer, just honest. The silence no longer hid anything. It simply sat there, steady and plain, waiting for me to move through it. I locked the front door, checked each window, and walked room to room with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. This time, I wasn't looking for missing papers or altered drawers. I was making sure every space in this home was mine again. I started by securing the things that should have been secure long before. I changed the passwords on my accounts, every single one. Email, pension, property portals. I set up alerts that would notify me the moment someone tried to access what wasn't theirs. I stored documents in a safe only I could open, and I placed duplicates in a locked box at the bank. These were actions I should have taken years earlier, but age makes you believe trust is enough. It isn't. Protection is something you build with your own hands. Later that afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table, the same place where my daughter once told me she would take care of everything. I now understood how dangerous those words can be when spoken by the wrong person. Trust is quiet. It grows slowly, the way comfort does. But betrayal grows the same way. Quiet, patient, unnoticed, until it stands right behind you. I thought about every small moment I brushed aside. The missing mail, the sudden interest in my paperwork, the tone she used when she talked about using space better. None of it was harmless. It was groundwork. As the sunlight moved across the floor, I realized how easily silence can be mistaken for peace. When my wife was alive, silence was rest. After she passed, silence became a door I never opened, afraid of what I'd hear behind it. My daughter used that silence. She filled it with decisions I never approved, plans I never saw, conversations meant for closed rooms. If you're not paying attention, betrayal doesn't need noise. It only needs you to look the other way. That evening, I stepped outside for a walk around the block. Slow steps, steady breathing, the air cooler than before. No one rushed me. No one corrected my pace or hinted that I was taking up space. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. My own rhythm, not someone else's schedule. I returned home and made tea, letting the steam rise and fade into the quiet room. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel like pressure. It felt like my own company. Before bed, I wrote down a few things I knew I needed to remember, not for fear, but for clarity. Check your accounts often. Read every paper twice. Protect your access. Pay attention to small shifts in tone and behavior. Age does not make you helpless. Ignorance does. And nothing protects you more than knowing exactly what belongs to you. I turned off the light, letting the room settle into darkness, and with a steady breath, I understood the truth I wished I'd learned earlier. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.